They say trust is the foundation of every marriage, and for years, I thought ours was rock solid. Mary, my wife, was my partner in every sense of the word. Her laughter could light up a room, and her support was unwavering. Or so I believed. The first crack appeared on an ordinary Tuesday. She was texting someone, her fingers flying over her phone with the kind of urgency reserved for emergencies. "Who's that?" I asked casually. She looked up, startled, almost like a child caught sneaking cookies before dinner. "Oh, just work," she said, flashing a smile. But it wasn't her usual smile. No, this one was rehearsed. I didn't press further. I simply nodded. But the seed of doubt had been planted. That seed sprouted quickly. Little things began standing out. Changes so subtle they could have gone unnoticed if I wasn't paying attention. She started leaving for work earlier and coming home later. On weekends, she suddenly had errands that took hours. And the perfume. God, the perfume. Mary had always been a one spritz is enough kind of woman, but now she was drowning herself in it. At first, I chalked it up to a phase. Maybe she was just trying to feel good about herself. Who was I to judge? Then there was the night she came home late. I had dinner ready, her favorite, chicken Alfredo. But she walked in, smiled weakly, and muttered, "I'm not hungry." She didn't look tired, though. If anything, she looked refreshed. Her cheeks were flushed, her lips slightly swollen. She claimed she'd been at work, but there was no way a pile of spreadsheets could make someone look that radiant. I know what you're thinking. Why didn't I confront her then and there? Trust me, I wanted to. But there's a fine line between suspicion and certainty, and I wasn't about to jump to conclusions without proof. Besides, if I've learned anything in life, it's that people show their true colors when they think no one is watching. So, I started watching. Nothing invasive. No snooping through her phone or following her around like some crazed detective. I just paid attention, and paying attention brought me to the receipt. I found it while cleaning up the living room, tucked carelessly between the cushions of the couch. A receipt for dinner at an upscale restaurant downtown. Dinner for two. I flipped it over, hoping to find some innocent explanation scrawled on the back, but it was blank. Mary had never mentioned going out to eat that week. Still, I said nothing. The final straw came one night when her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She was in the shower, so I glanced at the screen. The notification read, "Can't wait to see you again." No name, just a number. My stomach twisted, and for a moment, I felt like I couldn't breathe. But I didn't touch the phone. I didn't barge into the bathroom demanding answers. Instead, I did something most wouldn't understand. I smiled. You see, while betrayal cuts deep, there's a strange power in holding the knowledge before your enemy knows you've found it. I didn't know who this other person was or how far things had gone, but I knew one thing for certain. My wife, my Mary, was hiding something from me. It was almost amusing, really. She thought she was so clever, spinning her web of lies right under my nose. But here's the thing about webs, they're fragile. And the more you try to expand them, the easier they are to break. I just needed to wait for the right moment. Trust is the foundation of every marriage, sure. But once that trust is gone, the foundation isn't just cracked, it's crumbling. And Mary? Well, she was about to discover just how well I could rebuild. Suspicion can gnaw at you like a slow-acting poison, but nothing compares to the venom of certainty. The night I followed Mary was a turning point, one that I knew I'd never forget. It was a Tuesday, ironically the same day my doubts about her had first surfaced. She had left the house earlier than usual, wearing a dress that she used to reserve for our date nights. She said it was for an important meeting, but there was no meeting on earth that needed a woman to wear perfume that strong. I wasn't planning on following her, not initially, but as I sat in the quiet of our home, staring at the clock ticking past 7:30 p.m., something inside me snapped. Call it intuition, call it anger, or maybe just the need for answers. I grabbed my keys, slipped out the door, and drove to her office. Her car wasn't in the parking lot. At that moment, I had two choices: drive home and pretend everything was fine or keep going. I kept going. Her car's GPS tracker, something I discreetly installed the week before, pinged her location at a boutique hotel on the other side of town. Boutique hotels weren't places for meetings. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly I thought it might snap in two. Still, I stayed calm, breathing deeply. There's a strange clarity that comes with heartbreak. You stop asking why and start focusing on what next. When I arrived at the hotel, I parked a few spaces away from her car, turned off my engine, and waited. I wasn't about to storm in like some enraged fool, shouting and making a scene. No, I wanted to see it with my own eyes, to gather proof, not just for myself, but for whatever came next. It didn't take long. 10 minutes later, Mary emerged from the lobby. She wasn't alone. There he was. Tall, sharp suit, smug smile. The kind of man who oozed confidence in all the worst ways. He had his hand on her lower back, guiding her to his car like she was some prize he'd just won. Mary laughed at something he said, the kind of laugh that used to be reserved for me. It wasn't forced or awkward. It was genuine. That was the hardest part. She wasn't just cheating on me. She was happy doing it. I could have confronted them right there in the parking lot. I could have rolled down my window, shouted her name, and watched the color drain from her face. But I didn't. Instead, I picked up my phone and snapped a picture. The flash was off, the angle discreet. Proof. They drove off together, and I followed at a distance. They ended up at a restaurant downtown, the same one on the receipt I'd found earlier. For 2 hours, I sat in my car, watching through the tinted glass as they sipped wine, leaned in close, and shared jokes that I'd never hear. At one point, he reached across the table and took her hand. She didn't pull away. You might think I felt rage in that moment. I didn't. What I felt was detachment. Like I was watching someone else's life fall apart, not mine. The man I saw through the window wasn't my Mary. She looked like her, sure, but the person I married would never do this. When they finally left the restaurant, I didn't follow. I had all the proof I needed. Instead, I drove home, parked in the driveway, and sat in the dark for a long time. The house felt different somehow, colder. I thought about the years we'd spent together, the life we'd built, and the future we'd planned. None of it seemed real anymore. By the time Mary came home, it was almost midnight. She walked in quietly, assuming I was asleep. I heard her heels clicking on the hardwood floor as she made her way to the bedroom. I could have confronted her then, but I didn't. Not yet. Confrontation is a card you only play once, and when I played mine, I wanted it to be decisive. So, I waited. Waited for her to slip into bed. Waited for her breathing to even out as she drifted off to sleep. And as I lay there beside her, staring at the ceiling, I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't let this destroy me. Whatever came next, I'd face it on my terms. Mary and her lover thought they were in control, but they had no idea what was coming. You know, it's one thing to suspect betrayal. It's another to confirm it. But what really gets under your skin is when the person responsible for your misery has the audacity to show up at your door. It happened 3 days after my quiet discovery. Mary was out, running errands, she claimed, though I knew exactly where she was. I was at home, pretending to enjoy a football game, when the doorbell rang. For a moment, I thought it was Mary, maybe forgetting her keys. But no, it was him. The man standing on my porch was every bit the smug caricature I'd seen through the restaurant window. Perfectly styled hair, a suit that probably cost more than my mortgage, and a grin that could make you want to punch something. He didn't even bother to look nervous. No, he looked pleased, like he'd already won whatever game he thought we were playing. I opened the door, keeping my expression neutral. "Can I help you?" "You must be Michael," he said, his tone dripping with mock friendliness. "I'm Andrew. I think it's time we talked." Andrew. So, the man now occupying my wife's heart had a name. I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. "Talk about what?" He smirked, shoving his hands in his pockets. "About Mary. About how things are going to change around here." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Here was this stranger, standing on my porch, telling me how my life was going to unfold. But I didn't laugh. I didn't say anything. I just stepped aside and gestured for him to come in. He hesitated, clearly not expecting my reaction. "You want me to come inside?" "Why not?" I said, smiling faintly. "We're both adults. Let's have a civil conversation." For a moment, he looked unsure. But arrogance won out, and he stepped into the house. He glanced around, his eyes lingering on the photos of Mary and me on the walls. I wondered if he felt any guilt seeing the life he was helping to destroy. Probably not. I led him into the living room and motioned to the chair across from mine. "Sit," I said. He started toward the chair, but before he could sit down, I spoke again. "You know," I said, my tone casual, "not all battles are fought with words." Andrew froze mid-step, his eyes narrowing. "What's that supposed to mean?" I stood up slowly, my smile never wavering. "It means you walked into the wrong house, Andrew." And that's when I hit him. Not a wild, reckless punch, but a calculated strike that sent him stumbling backward into the coffee table. His smug grin was gone, replaced by shock and pain. He scrambled to his feet, but I was faster. A shove, a twist of his arm, and he was down again, gasping for air. "Michael," he stammered, holding up a hand as if to ward me off. "Wait, we can talk about this." "We were talking," I said, standing over him. "Now we're not." I didn't beat him senseless. That would have been too easy, too impulsive. No, I just left him battered enough to send a message. By the time I was done, he was groaning on the floor, clutching his ribs. I grabbed my phone and dialed for an ambulance. Not because I felt sorry for him, but because I wanted him out of my house. When the paramedics arrived, I didn't say much. Just that he'd slipped and fallen, a story they didn't question. Andrew, to his credit, didn't contradict me. Maybe he realized how much worse things could have been. As they loaded him onto the stretcher, I leaned down and whispered, "Stay away from my house. Stay away from my wife. You've already lost this game, Andrew. You just don't know it yet." His eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw real fear. He didn't say a word as they wheeled him out, leaving me standing in the doorway, watching the ambulance drive away. When Mary came home later that night, she didn't mention Andrew, and neither did I. She acted like everything was normal, like her life wasn't teetering on the edge of collapse. I almost admired her composure. But deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. Andrew had underestimated me, and Mary still thought I was in the dark. They were playing checkers. I was playing chess. And in this game, I wasn't about to lose. By now, I knew two things. Andrew was arrogant enough to think he'd gotten the better of me, and Mary still believed she was operating in secrecy. That suited me perfectly. There's an advantage in being underestimated. It gives you the upper hand when the time for action arrives. After Andrew's little hospital-bound exit, I realized it wasn't enough to simply deal with him physically. People like him thrive on chaos, on creating messes they think they can walk away from unscathed. No, I needed a plan that wouldn't just rattle him. It would destroy everything he thought he controlled. And Mary? She learned that actions have consequences, even when they're dressed up as love. First, I called my lawyer. Greg was an old college friend who had seen me through a lot. Business disputes, property acquisitions, and now this. When I explained the situation, he didn't even flinch. "You've got evidence, right?" he asked, his tone pragmatic. "Plenty," I replied. I sent him the photos I'd taken outside the hotel, the texts I'd managed to recover from Mary's phone when she wasn't looking, and even the receipt I'd found tucked into the couch. Greg whistled low when he saw the file I'd compiled. "This isn't just evidence," he said. "This is a damn dossier." "That's the idea," I said. "How do we proceed?" Greg outlined a strategy that was both brutal and brilliant. We'd secure my finances first, making sure Mary couldn't touch a dime of my assets once the divorce proceedings began. Then we'd subtly introduce the evidence, not in a way that would humiliate her publicly, yet, but in a way that would leave her no room to contest the truth. This wasn't just about divorce, it was about control, about taking back what she thought she could take from me. Next, I started withdrawing funds from our joint accounts, moving them into private ones she couldn't access. Nothing drastic, just small amounts at first, enough to stay under her radar. At the same time, I began cataloging everything we owned together. The house, the cars, the investments. If things went to court, I wanted a clear record of who contributed what. But finances were only one part of the plan. I needed allies. Mary's best friend, Diane, was my first target. She and I had always been cordial, though not particularly close. Over lunch one afternoon, I casually mentioned how distant Mary had been lately. Diane, who was never one to hold back, let out a sigh. Honestly, Michael, I've noticed it too. She's been different. I wasn't sure if I should say anything. I leaned in, feigning concern. Do you think she's okay? I mean, is it work stress? Something I've done? Diane hesitated, then shook her head. I don't know. She hasn't said much, but there's definitely something going on. She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. Why do you ask? I shrugged, playing my part perfectly. Just a feeling, I guess. You know how you can tell when someone's pulling away? Her expression softened. Michael, I'm sure it's nothing. Mary loves you. She's probably just in a phase. A phase. Sure. I didn't press further, but Diane's reaction told me everything I needed to know. She suspected something, even if she didn't have the full picture. That suspicion would be useful later. Meanwhile, I kept tabs on Andrew. Hospital visits are easy to track when you know the right people, and I had no problem finding out when he'd been discharged. For all his bravado, he hadn't filed any charges against me, likely because he didn't want the police digging into why he'd been at my house in the first place. That was fine by me. The less attention he brought to himself, the easier it was to dismantle his life quietly. I also started planting seeds of doubt in Mary's world. A casually misplaced photo of us on vacation, a sudden mention of old memories during dinner, little reminders of the life we'd built together. She smiled at them, but there was something forced about it, like she was trying to convince herself she still cared. That was the point. Let her stew in her own guilt while I worked in the shadows. By the end of the week, I had everything in place. A lawyer prepared to strike, financial defenses locked down, and a growing network of information that kept me one step ahead of both Mary and Andrew. They thought they were in control. They thought I was just another clueless husband, fumbling around in the dark. But the truth? I was the one pulling the strings. And when the time came to cut them, neither of them would see it coming. There's something poetic about silence before a storm. It builds tension, amplifies every sound, every creak in the floorboards, every tick of the clock. And when the storm finally breaks, it doesn't just make noise. It demands attention. That was the night Andrew walked into my house for the second and last time. It was a Friday evening, and Mary had gone to visit her mother. Funny thing, though, her mother lives in Atlanta, and Mary's car was parked at the hotel downtown. I didn't bother tracking her movements further that night. I knew where she was, and I had bigger things to deal with. I'd already set the bait, and Andrew took it. Hook, line, and sinker. The doorbell rang, and I wasn't surprised to find him standing there, looking smug as ever. Unlike his last visit, his face showed no signs of the lesson I'd taught him days before. He had a fresh suit, a fresh haircut, and, apparently, a fresh dose of arrogance. "Michael," he said, his voice dripping with false civility, "we need to talk." I didn't react. No smile, no frown, just a blank, calm expression. "Come in," I said, stepping aside to let him in. He hesitated for a moment, as if he hadn't expected me to be so accommodating, then brushed past me into the house. As I shut the door, I couldn't help but notice how he walked with the confidence of someone who thought they owned the place. It was almost funny. Almost. I motioned toward the same chair he tried to claim last time. "Have a seat," I said. Andrew glanced at me, his smirk firmly in place. "You're surprisingly polite for someone who's lost." "Lost?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. I leaned against the wall, arms crossed, and tilted my head slightly. "Explain." He didn't sit down. Instead, he stepped closer, hands in his pockets, and said, "You've lost Mary. She's with me now, Michael. You're just delaying the inevitable. The sooner you accept that, the easier it'll be for everyone." I stared at him for a moment, letting his words hang in the air. There was no anger in my expression, no frustration, just a faint, almost amused smile. "You really believe that, don't you?" "It's not about belief," he said, his tone growing cocky. "It's a fact. Mary and I—" "Stop," I interrupted, holding up a hand. My voice was calm but firm, the kind of tone that cuts through bravado like a knife through butter. "Let's skip the speech, Andrew. You came here for one reason, so get to it." He blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. "All right," he said, regaining his composure. "I'm here to make things clear. You're out of the picture, Michael. You've already lost her to me. Deal with it." And there it was, the declaration he'd been rehearsing, no doubt, ever since his first failed attempt to intimidate me. I couldn't help but chuckle softly. "Deal with it," I echoed, nodding slowly. "All right." I stood up straight, pushing off the wall, and stepped closer. Andrew's smirk faltered slightly, but he held his ground. "But here's the thing," I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady tone. "Not all battles end with words." His brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" I didn't answer. Instead, I closed the distance between us in one swift motion, my fist connecting with his jaw before he could even react. The smirk vanished, replaced by a look of pure shock as he stumbled backward, clutching his face. "What the?" Before he could finish, I grabbed him by the collar and shoved him into the nearest wall. The picture frames rattled, one of them crashing to the floor, but I didn't care. This wasn't about decor. This was about sending a message. "You think you can walk into my house and dictate terms?" I growled, my voice low and cold. "You think you can take what's mine and walk away unscathed?" Andrew struggled, trying to push me off, but he was no match. "Michael, wait." "No." I cut him off, slamming him against the wall again for good measure. "You don't get to talk now. You've said enough." I wasn't aiming to seriously injure him, not this time. Just enough to remind him whose house he was in. A few punches, a well-placed shove, and he was crumpled on the floor, groaning in pain. I stood over him, breathing heavily but steady, and grabbed my phone. "Emergency services?" I said into the receiver, keeping my eyes on Andrew. "I've got an unwanted guest who had a little accident. He'll need a stretcher." By the time the paramedics arrived, Andrew was too dazed to argue. I stood in the doorway, watching as they loaded him into the ambulance. Before they shut the doors, I leaned in close and said, "You walk into my house again, and you won't be leaving in one piece. Understood?" His eyes, wide with fear, were the only answer I needed. When Mary came home later that night, I didn't mention a thing. But the chessboard had shifted, and the next move was mine. The night Andrew left on a stretcher, the house felt eerily quiet. I sat alone in the living room, nursing a glass of whiskey and staring at the shattered picture frame on the floor. It had been a photo of Mary and me on our honeymoon, a reminder of a time when everything had seemed so perfect. Now, it felt like a relic of a life that no longer existed. Mary came home late that night, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor as she walked in. I could hear her rummaging through her bag, probably looking for some excuse to explain her absence. I didn't get up to greet her. I didn't say a word. I just sat there, swirling the amber liquid in my glass, waiting for her to notice the tension in the air. She finally walked into the living room and froze when she saw me. Her eyes darted to the broken frame on the floor, then back to me. "What happened?" she asked, her voice careful, as though she were stepping onto a minefield. I looked up at her, my expression unreadable. "Nothing you'd be interested in," I said evenly, taking a slow sip of my drink. Her brow furrowed. "Michael, if something's wrong, just tell me." I chuckled softly, shaking my head. The audacity of her concern was almost laughable. "Something's wrong, all right," I said, setting the glass down on the coffee table. "But the question is, do you really want to know?" She hesitated, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of guilt in her eyes. "Michael, what's going on?" I stood up, taking my time, and walked over to her. "I could ask you the same thing, Mary," I said, my voice calm but edged with steel. "What's going on? Where were you tonight? Or last week? Or the week before that?" Her face paled, and she took a step back. "Michael, Don't," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "Don't lie to me. Not again." The room seemed to shrink around us, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down like a suffocating blanket. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, her eyes darted to the broken frame again, as if looking for an anchor in a sea of chaos. "I know about Andrew," I said, my voice steady but cutting. The name hung in the air like a grenade, and the explosion came in the form of her sharp intake of breath. Her hand flew to her mouth, and her eyes filled with tears. "Michael, she began, but I wasn't interested in her excuses. "Save it," I said, cutting her off. "I've known for weeks. I've seen the receipts, the texts, the meetings at the hotel. I even met him, Mary. He had the nerve to walk into my house and tell me I'd lost you to him." She staggered back as if I'd slapped her. You knew?" "I knew," I said, crossing my arms. "And I waited. I waited to see if you'd have the decency to tell me the truth. But you didn't. You just kept lying, kept sneaking around, as if I wouldn't notice." Her tears started falling then, and she reached for me, but I stepped back. "Michael, I'm so sorry." "Don't apologize," I said, my tone icy. "Not unless you mean it. And even then, it doesn't change anything." She crumpled onto the couch, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. For a moment, I felt a pang of pity for her, but it was quickly swallowed by the cold, hard truth. This was her doing, not mine. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "We'll discuss the terms in the morning." Her head snapped up, her tear-streaked face filled with panic. "Michael, please, don't do this. I made a mistake, but we can fix this. We can." "There's no we anymore," I said, cutting her off. "You made your choice, Mary. And now, I'm making mine." She tried to argue, tried to plead, but her words fell on deaf ears. I had made up my mind, and there was no going back. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my future. When she finally realized that I wasn't going to budge, she broke down completely. It was a pitiful sight, watching the woman I'd once loved reduced to this. But in that moment, I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a cold, unshakable resolve. As I walked out of the room, leaving her to her tears, I felt a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in weeks, I was no longer shackled by doubt or betrayal. The fallout was devastating, yes, but it was also necessary. Sometimes, you have to burn everything to the ground before you can start anew. And I was ready to start over. When I thought I'd seen the worst of Andrew, I underestimated just how desperate a man could get when his ego was bruised. The stretcher should have been his exit from my life, a warning he'd take seriously. Instead, it turned out to be the opening act of his retaliation, a pathetic attempt to claw back what little power he thought he had over me. It started subtly, like a whisper in the wind. Small rumors began circulating at work, whispers that I'd been unstable, that I'd been seen arguing with a man outside my house. At first, I didn't think much of it. Corporate environments are breeding grounds for gossip, and I had bigger things on my plate. But then I noticed something peculiar. Projects that were usually handed to me started going to someone else. Emails went unanswered. Meetings were held without me. Andrew, I realized, wasn't trying to beat me physically. He was targeting my reputation. I knew it was him when I received the anonymous email. "I know what you did," it said, with a grainy photo of me standing over him after our confrontation. It wasn't much, just me looming while he sat on the floor, bruised and pathetic. But the implication was clear. He wanted me to know that he still had a move to play. Now, I could have confronted him directly again, but that wasn't the game I wanted to play. Andrew thrived on chaos, on forcing reactions out of people. Giving him the satisfaction of knowing I was rattled would have been playing right into his hands. So instead, I turned to my lawyer. "Greg," I said during a late-night call, "Andrew's trying to smear me." "Let me guess," Greg replied, his voice calm and confident. "Anonymous emails, workplace rumors, maybe even a couple of veiled threats?" I sighed. "All of the above." Greg chuckled. "Classic narcissist move. Don't worry, Michael. People like Andrew are all bark and no bite. We'll handle this." And handle it we did. Greg's advice was simple. Let Andrew think he was winning while we built a case to dismantle him entirely. I started documenting everything, every email, every rumor, every whisper that could be traced back to him. I even hired a private investigator to dig into Andrew's background. It didn't take long to find cracks in his polished facade. The investigator uncovered a treasure trove of dirt, unpaid debts, an estranged ex-girlfriend who had a restraining order against him, and a failed business venture that left several investors fuming. Andrew, it seemed, was no stranger to burning bridges. Armed with this information, I waited for him to make his next move. And, predictably, he didn't disappoint. One afternoon, as I was leaving work, I found him leaning against my car in the parking lot. He looked more polished than he had any right to, considering his track record. "Michael," he said, flashing that infuriating smirk, "we need to talk." I didn't respond immediately. I simply stared at him, my expression unreadable. Finally, I said, "You seem to enjoy walking into places you're not welcome. First my house, now my car. What's next?" "My office." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't over. Mary is with me now, and no amount of posturing is going to change that." I took a step closer, my voice low and steady. "You think this is about Mary? You think I care who she's with? You've made this personal, Andrew. And that was your first mistake?" His smirk faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "What are you going to do? Hit me again? You don't scare me, Michael." "No," I said, stepping even closer. "I don't need to scare you, but I will destroy you." He laughed nervously, but there was fear in his eyes now. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" I said, pulling out my phone. I opened a file and showed him the list of names, people from his past who had plenty to say about him. His debts, his failed business, his restraining order, all neatly cataloged, ready to be used. Andrew's face drained of color. "Where did you get that?" "Doesn't matter," I said, my voice cold. "What matters is what I can do with it. You've spent your life burning bridges, Andrew. Did you think you'd get away with it forever?" He took a step back, suddenly unsure of himself. This is illegal." I chuckled darkly. "So is harassment, slander, and adultery. But here we are." For the first time, Andrew looked genuinely defeated. He muttered something under his breath and walked away, his confidence shattered. I didn't stop him. I didn't need to. The game was over, and he knew it. When I got home that night, Mary was waiting for me, her eyes red from crying. She opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand. "Not now," I said, walking past her. There were still battles to fight, but Andrew's chapter was finally closing. And as far as I was concerned, he was already a footnote in a story that was no longer his to tell. The house was unbearably quiet after Andrew's defeat. Silence has a way of amplifying every thought, every emotion, until they're deafening. Mary and I existed in the same space, but in different worlds. She lingered in the kitchen most nights, her movements careful, as if she were afraid to disturb the fragile air between us. I kept my distance, staying in the living room, working or pretending to watch TV, ignoring the weight of her gaze. It was on one of these nights, about a week later, that she finally cracked. I heard her footsteps long before she appeared. Slow, deliberate, hesitant. When she came into the room, she looked smaller, more fragile. Her eyes were puffy and red, her hair undone in a way that made her look years older. "Michael," she said softly, her voice trembling, "can we talk?" I didn't respond immediately. I let her stand there, twisting her hands nervously, as I stared at the paperwork on my lap. After a long pause, I closed the folder and set it aside, leaning back in my chair. "Go ahead." Her shoulders sagged slightly, and she took a tentative step forward. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking, "for everything. For lying, for what I did to us. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but You're right," I interrupted, my tone colder than I intended. "You don't." Her face crumpled, and tears welled in her eyes. "Michael, please," she whispered. I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. But I love you. I never stopped loving you." "Love?" I said, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "You think love is sneaking around with another man? Lying to my face? Telling me you're working late while you're at some hotel with him? That's not love, Mary. That's betrayal." She flinched as if I'd struck her, her tears spilling over. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said, her voice trembling. I don't even know why I did it. I don't know, lost, confused, lost. I echoed, shaking my head. That's a nice way to justify ruining a marriage. She broke down completely then, sinking onto the couch, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to remind her of the love we'd once shared. But the other part, the part that had been shattered by her actions, stayed rooted in place. I'll do anything to fix this, she pleaded through her tears. Therapy, counseling, whatever it takes. Please, Michael, don't give up on us. I stared at her for a long moment, my emotions warring within me. Finally, I spoke, my voice low but firm. There is no us anymore, Mary. You killed at the moment you chose him over me. Her sobs grew louder, and she buried her face in her hands. I'm sorry, she whispered, over and over again, as if the words could somehow undo the damage. I stood, unable to watch her crumble any longer. I'm going to bed, I said curtly. We'll discuss the divorce papers tomorrow. As I walked up the stairs, her cries followed me, a haunting echo of the life we'd lost. The next day, just as I was beginning to settle into the clarity of my decision, a new thread emerged. It came in the form of Andrew's younger brother, Caleb. I hadn't seen or heard of him before, but it was clear he had inherited Andrew's arrogance, if not his intelligence. I first noticed him outside my office, leaning casually against a lamppost. He didn't approach, just watched as I walked to my car. The next day, he was at the coffee shop I frequented. Again, no words, just an unsettling, lingering presence. Finally, on the third day, he made his move. Michael, he said, stepping into my path as I left work. He was taller than Andrew, lean but with a wiry strength. His eyes gleamed with a dangerous intensity that Andrew had lacked. We need to talk. Do we? I said, not breaking stride. He grabbed my arm, forcing me to stop. You hurt my brother. I shook him off, narrowing my eyes. Your brother walked into my home and made himself a problem. I solved it. Caleb's lips curled into a snarl. You think this is over? Andrew may have backed down, but I won't. I stepped closer, my voice low and calm. Let me make something clear. If you're here to intimidate me, you're wasting your time. If you're here to fight, you'll leave worse off than he did. And if you're here to stir up trouble, I'll make sure you regret it. Caleb glared at me, but I could see the hesitation in his eyes. He wasn't used to being challenged, and he didn't like it. Finally, he stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. This isn't over, he said, his voice dripping with venom. For your sake, it should be, I replied, brushing past him and walking to my car. I didn't see Caleb again after that, but his presence lingered like a shadow, a reminder that some battles don't end cleanly. Still, I was prepared. People like Caleb and Andrew always overplay their hand, and when they did, I'd be ready. As for Mary, she retreated further into herself, her guilt consuming her. She tried to apologize again, to reach out, but I was done listening. My focus was on the future, on rebuilding the life she had tried to destroy. The pieces were still falling into place, but one thing was certain. This story wasn't over. Not yet. When you think the storm has passed, that's when you need to watch the horizon. I thought I had seen the last of Andrew and Caleb. Mary had retreated into herself, her regret like a constant shadow in our home. My divorce plans were in motion, and my lawyer, Greg, was making sure every thread was tied tight. But people like Andrew and Caleb never leave quietly. They crave chaos, and chaos was exactly what they brought to my doorstep. It started with whispers. Friends and colleagues began hinting that stories were circulating about me. Michael's dangerous. Michael's abusive. I even overheard someone suggesting I had a drinking problem. The rumors were ridiculous, but they were spreading fast. I knew immediately that Andrew was behind it. He couldn't take losing gracefully, so he was trying to destroy my reputation. What Andrew didn't realize was that I was always 2 steps ahead. Greg had already advised me to anticipate these tactics. With the evidence my private investigator had dug up, Andrew's unpaid debts, his restraining orders, and the investors he'd burned, I had a dossier that could destroy him with a single phone call. But I didn't act right away. Patience is a weapon, and I plan to wield it at the right time. Diane, Mary's best friend, showed up at my office unannounced. She was the last person I expected to see, but her expression told me she wasn't there for pleasantries. "Michael," she said, sitting across from me, "I know what Mary did, and I know how much it hurt you. But you need to know something about Andrew." I raised an eyebrow. "Go on." Diane leaned forward, her voice dropping. "Andrew's been playing this game for years. You're not the first husband he's done this to." Her words hit like a punch. "What do you mean?" "He targets married women," Diane explained. "Finds the ones who are vulnerable, convinces them they deserve better, and then ruins their lives. He doesn't care about them. It's just a power trip for him." I wanted to tell Mary, but she wouldn't listen. The pieces began to fall into place. Andrew wasn't just some arrogant opportunist. He was a predator. Knowing this made my resolve even stronger. I thanked Diane and promised her that Andrew's games were about to end. Andrew, emboldened by his smear campaign, decided to confront me one last time. He orchestrated a public spectacle, showing up at a charity gala I was attending for work. Caleb was with him, both of them smug and self-assured, as if they'd already won. Andrew didn't waste any time. He approached me in front of a small crowd, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Michael," he said, his tone mocking, "how does it feel to lose everything? Your wife, your reputation. What's left for you?" I stayed calm, my face betraying nothing. "Andrew," I replied, "you've always talked too much. Let me show you how actions speak louder than words." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small stack of documents. "You might want to take a look at these," I said, handing them to him. He hesitated, but curiosity got the better of him. As he flipped through the pages, his smug expression dissolved into one of panic. "What is this?" he stammered. "It's your life, Andrew," I said evenly. "Your unpaid debts, the businesses you've bankrupted, the restraining orders from women who've seen through your lies. I wonder how the people here would feel if I handed this over to the press." Andrew's face turned pale. "You wouldn't." "Oh, I would," I said, stepping closer. "You walked into my life thinking you could take everything from me. But the thing about people like you, Andrew, is that you always overestimate yourselves. You thought you were untouchable. You're not." Caleb, who had been watching silently, tried to step in. "This is harassment," he growled. "You have no right." I turned to him, my voice cutting like ice. "You should walk away while you still can, Caleb. You've been nothing but a shadow in this game, and I have no problem snuffing you out too." For once, Caleb looked unsure of himself. He grabbed Andrew's arm and muttered something, but Andrew was too stunned to move. I turned back to the crowd, many of whom had overheard the exchange. "I'm not here to make a scene," I said, my voice calm but firm. "But I think it's time people knew the truth about Andrew." I handed a copy of the documents to a reporter who had been lurking nearby. "Do what you want with these," I said, turning back to Andrew. "This is over." Andrew and Caleb left the gala in disgrace, their confidence shattered. The press had a field day with the story, and Andrew's reputation was destroyed. He disappeared from my life after that, and Caleb followed soon after. Back at home, Mary was a shadow of the woman she once was. She tried to apologize again, to offer some shred of hope for reconciliation, but I was past the point of caring. The divorce went through quietly, with no drama on her part. I think she finally understood the depth of her betrayal and knew there was no way back. As for me, I began to rebuild. My reputation recovered. My life moved forward, and I found peace in the knowledge that I had faced betrayal head-on and come out stronger. Diane and I stayed in touch, her honesty a rare comfort during a turbulent time. One night, as I sat alone in the house that no longer felt like home, I reflected on everything that had happened. Betrayal, revenge, redemption. It had all played out like a twisted game of chess. But in the end, I had won. Not because I had destroyed Andrew or Caleb, not because I had exposed Mary's lies, but because I had reclaimed my life and my dignity. And that, I realized, was the ultimate victory.